Have you ever lain next to someone and felt more alone than you did before you met them? That silence, that physical distance that grows even as you share the same bed is not a mystery, it's a message. And tonight, I want to help you understand what that message actually is. Because once you understand it, you stop taking it personally and you start taking your life back. Have you ever lain next to someone and felt more alone than you did before you met them? That silence, that physical distance that grows even as you share the same bed is not a mystery, it's a message. And tonight, I want to help you understand what that message actually is. Because once you understand it, you stop taking it personally and you start taking your life back. So let's start here with the thing nobody tells you about intimacy. We think of sex as a physical act, but it was never really about the body. It is one of the most vulnerable things a human being can do, because for those few minutes, you are asking to be seen without your armor on. You are asking someone to witness you at your most undefended, your softest, your most unguarded, your most real. And here is what I want you to understand. For a person whose entire sense of self is built on the outside, on image, on performance, on being perceived a certain way, that kind of exposure doesn't feel like love. It feels like danger. It feels like death. Think about what it actually means to be truly intimate with another person. It means dropping the mask. It means being witnessed in your ordinary humanity, not the curated version, not the impressive version, but the real one. For most of us, that's uncomfortable, but survivable. We can tolerate being seen because somewhere inside, we know we are worthy of love even in our unpolished form. But for someone who has spent a lifetime constructing an identity out of control, out of being admired rather than known, that kind of exposure threatens the entire structure they've built themselves upon. If you truly see them, the fear, the smallness, the shame they've spent years outrunning, then the illusion collapses. And so, without even consciously choosing it, the body starts to protect the illusion. Distance becomes the defense. Withdrawal becomes the wall. This is why you might notice that the withdrawal isn't random. It often shows up right after moments of real closeness, after a conversation where you opened up, after a moment where the mask slipped, even briefly, and something true passed between you. That's not a coincidence. That's the nervous system sounding an alarm. Too close, too seen. Retreat. And so intimacy, instead of being the doorway to connection, becomes the very thing that triggers the shutdown. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it changes everything about how you interpret what's happening to you. You might have spent months, even years, wondering what's wrong with your body, your desirability, your worth. You've probably replayed the moment they turned away from you 1,000 times, searching your own reflection for the flaw. But what if the coldness was never a verdict on you at all? What if it was simply the sound of someone protecting a version of themselves that cannot survive being truly known? This doesn't mean the pain isn't real. It is real, and it deserves to be grieved. Being denied intimacy by someone you love is one of the loneliest experiences a human being can have, because it happens in the very space that is supposed to hold you the closest. But understanding the mechanism underneath it is the beginning of your freedom from it. Because once you see that their retreat is about their relationship to being witnessed, not about your body, not about your beauty, not about your love, you stop performing surgery on yourself trying to fix a wound that was never yours to fix. You were never too much. You were simply standing in front of someone who could not survive being truly seen. Let's talk about something that took me a long time to understand myself. The difference between attraction and attunement. Because most of us were never taught the difference, and that confusion is exactly what keeps so many people stuck, waiting for a desire that was never going to return. Desire, real desire, the kind that sustains itself over years and decades, is not primarily physical. I know that sounds strange to say about something so bodily, but think about it honestly for a moment. What actually makes you want someone long after the newness has worn off? It's not just their face or their body, it's the feeling of being met. It's the experience of another person actually tracking you, your moods, your inner weather, the things you don't even say out loud, but that they somehow notice anyway. That felt sense of, I am not alone in here. Someone is actually paying attention to my experience. That is the soil that desire grows in. Without that soil, desire has nothing to root into. It doesn't matter how attractive you are, how much effort you put into showing up for them, how badly you want to be wanted. Desire cannot manufacture itself out of thin air where there is no real attunement holding it up. Now, attunement asks something specific of a person. It asks them to turn their attention outward, away from themselves, and to actually track another human being's internal experience as if it matters as much as their own. It asks curiosity. It asks patience. It asks the willingness to sit with someone else's feelings, even when those feelings are inconvenient, even when they interrupt what the other person wants in that moment. And this is precisely the capacity that tends to be missing in someone who relates to others primarily through usefulness. What can this person do for me? How does this person make me look? How does this person serve the story I'm telling about myself? When you are related to as a function rather than as a whole, separate, feeling person, there is no attunement happening. There's observation, maybe. There's strategy, often. But there isn't the deep, patient tracking of your inner world that desire actually requires to stay alive. So what happens over time in a dynamic like this? The physical chemistry may have been real at the start. I'm not telling you it was fake, but chemistry without attunement is like a fire without fuel. It burns bright and fast, and then it has nothing left to consume. And so what gets mistaken for we're just not compatible anymore, or the spark died, is actually something much simpler and much sadder. There was never enough real seeing happening between you for a desire to be sustained. You may have been begging in 1,000 indirect ways to be tracked, to be understood, to be met in your actual experience rather than managed or placated. And when that need went unanswered again and again, the body, which is far more honest than words, simply stopped generating desire for a dynamic that wasn't nourishing it either. Here's the important distinction I want you to walk away with. This was never a reflection of your desirability. Desire didn't disappear because you became less attractive or less deserving. It disappeared because it was never given anything real to feed on. You cannot outperform, out-beautify, or out-try your way into being truly desired by someone who does not have the capacity for attunement in the first place. That capacity either exists or it doesn't, and no amount of your effort can manufacture it in someone else. You were never the reason the fire went out. There simply was never enough real fuel for it to burn on. I want to take you back for a moment to the very beginning, because if we're going to understand why the desire disappeared, we have to understand what it was actually attached to in the first place. And I promise you, once you see this clearly, so many confusing memories are going to suddenly make sense. In the beginning, there was a kind of electricity that felt like nothing you'd experienced before. You admired them. Maybe you even idealized them a little, their confidence, their charm, the way they seemed to move through the world like they owned it. And here's the part that's hard to say out loud. That admiration wasn't incidental to the attraction they felt toward you. It was the fuel for it. When you looked at them with wonder, with a kind of starry-eyed belief that they were exceptional, extraordinary, larger than life, they weren't just enjoying that, they were feeding on it. Your admiration functioned like a mirror. And in that mirror, they got to see the version of themselves they most needed to believe was real. This is something so few people understand about this dynamic. The passion at the start often has very little to do with who you actually are. It has to do with what you were reflecting back. You were cast, without ever agreeing to the role, as the audience, the one whose eyes made the performance worthwhile. And as long as you stayed in that role, as long as the applause kept coming, the desire stayed alive, because the desire was never really about your body or your presence. It was about the reflection you provided. But here's what happens next, and this is the part that will make so many pieces click into place. You are a real person. You have needs. You have bad days. You have opinions that don't always align with theirs. You get tired. You ask questions. You stop clapping quite so automatically, because somewhere along the way, you actually fell in love with a human being and started relating to them as one, flaws and all. And the moment you did that, without even realizing it, you stepped out of the role of mirror and back into the role of a separate, whole person with your own inner world. And that is precisely the moment the mirror cracked. Because once you saw them clearly as flawed, as human, as someone capable of hurting you, you could no longer reflect back the flawless image they needed. And a person whose sense of self depends on that reflection experiences your clear sight not as intimacy but as loss. The very thing that should have deepened your bond, you knowing them more fully, more honestly, was actually experienced as a kind of abandonment on their end, because the fantasy they needed you to hold could no longer survive contact with reality. This is why the desire so often fades in direct proportion to how well you actually get to know someone. It is not a coincidence. It's not that closeness naturally kills passion, the way people so often assume. It's that in this particular dynamic, passion was never built on closeness in the first place. It was built on illusion, and illusions cannot survive being truly seen for what they are. If you're sitting with the ache of this right now, mourning a passion that seemed to vanish the moment you became real to them, I want you to hear this clearly. It was never your job to keep performing the reflection. It was never your job to stay small and dazzled so that someone else's fragile sense of self could remain intact. You didn't lose their desire by becoming real. You simply stopped being willing to be a mirror instead of a person, and that was never a loss. That was the beginning of your freedom. I want to talk now about something that's uncomfortable to name, but naming it is exactly what will set you free from it, and that is the way affection itself can quietly become a currency, something dispensed and withheld rather than something freely given. Think about how intimacy is supposed to work in a healthy bond. It flows. It rises and falls naturally with closeness, with rest, with how connected two people feel on any given day, but it isn't wielded. It isn't handed out as a reward for good behavior and pulled back as a punishment for the wrong one. In a healthy dynamic, affection is an expression of feeling, not a tool of control. But in the dynamic we're talking about tonight, you may have noticed a pattern that felt confusing for a long time before you could even name it, that closeness seemed to appear right after you did something that pleased them. And it seemed to vanish right after you asserted a need, expressed a hurt, or held a boundary. If you've lived this, you know exactly the feeling I'm describing. You start, without even realizing it, to track their mood the way a sailor tracks the weather scanning for signs of whether tonight will be warm or cold, whether you're going to be reached for or turned away from. And here's the part that's so disorienting. You start to believe that if you just behave a little better, apologize a little faster, ask for a little less, the warmth will come back. So you begin shrinking. You begin editing yourself in real time, trying to become whatever version of you seems most likely to earn back the affection that was there just days before. And slowly, without ever agreeing to it, intimacy stops being about connection and starts being about compliance. This is what I mean when I say sex becomes a transaction rather than a connection. It is no longer an expression of two people wanting to be close to one another. It becomes a mechanism, sometimes conscious, often not for maintaining power in the relationship, given when you've been agreeable, withheld when you've expressed something inconvenient, like anger or grief, or a boundary that threatens their sense of control. And I want to be very clear about something here. This doesn't necessarily mean the other person is sitting there scheming, rubbing their hands together, calculating your submission. Often, it is far more unconscious than that. It's simply the pattern that emerges when someone's core relationship to love is rooted in control rather than in trust, when closeness has always felt safer to them as something they administer rather than something they surrender to. But regardless of whether it's conscious or not, the effect on you is the same. You start to feel like you're auditioning for affection. You start to feel like your worth in the relationship is measured by how easy you are to manage. And this is one of the most corrosive experiences a person can go through in an intimate relationship, because it takes something that is supposed to be the safest, most vulnerable space between two people, and it turns it into another arena where you have to perform to be accepted. If this is your experience, I want you to really hear this. Needing to earn basic affection through compliance is not what love looks like, no matter how normal it may have started to feel. Real intimacy doesn't come with an invoice. It isn't a reward you unlock by being agreeable enough, quiet enough, undemanding enough. The moment you find yourself calculating what you need to do or not do in order to be touched, held, or wanted, that is the moment to recognize that what you're experiencing is not love asking to be earned. It is control, wearing love's clothing. I want to invite you now to zoom out even further than the relationship you're in, because what we're about to look at didn't actually begin with you at all. It began decades before you ever entered the picture, in a childhood you never witnessed, shaped by wounds you had no part in creating. Underneath almost every pattern of withdrawal, there is a story, and it's very rarely the story of a person who simply doesn't care. More often, it's the story of a small child who learned very early and very painfully that closeness was not safe. Maybe closeness meant being engulfed, swallowed up by a parent's needs, used as an extension of someone else's identity, never allowed to exist as a separate self. Or maybe closeness meant the opposite, reaching out and being met with absence, with coldness, with a caregiver who simply wasn't there emotionally, so that wanting connection at all became associated with the pain of not receiving it. Either way, that child learned a lesson that got wired into the nervous system long before language could even make sense of it. Closeness is dangerous. Closeness leads to loss of self, or it leads to abandonment. Either way, it hurts. Now, that child grows into an adult, and the wound doesn't disappear just because time has passed. It goes underground. It becomes an automatic response, a survival strategy running quietly in the background, completely disconnected from conscious thought. And so when real intimacy starts to build in an adult relationship, when things start to feel close, safe, tender, connected, that old alarm system doesn't know the difference between then and now. It doesn't know that this partner, this moment, this bed is not the same as the original wound. All it knows is closeness is happening, and closeness has historically meant danger. So it does what it was trained to do. It pulls the emergency brake, it creates distance. Sometimes it even manufactures conflict, criticism, or coldness, anything to reestablish the safety of distance before the vulnerability of closeness can be used against them, the way it once was. This is what I mean when I say withdrawal is often a reenactment. It's not really about you, sitting there in the present moment, wanting to be close to someone you love. You have become, without either of you fully realizing it, a stand-in for every person who ever made closeness feel unsafe. Your reaching for them gets processed by their nervous system as a threat, not because reaching for someone is inherently threatening, but because reaching was dangerous once, a long time ago, with someone else entirely. I want to be careful here, because understanding this is not the same as excusing it, and it is definitely not a reason for you to stay and wait for someone to heal a wound that is theirs to heal, not yours to fix. You cannot love someone out of a trauma response. You cannot be patient enough, gentle enough, or self-sacrificing enough to override a nervous system pattern that was built over years, often before you were even born. That work, if it happens at all, has to be done by them through their own willingness to look at where the fear actually comes from. But for you, understanding this can be its own form of liberation, because it means you can finally stop asking the question that's been eating you alive, what is wrong with me that they can't be close to me? And start asking a much more accurate one. What happened to them, long before I arrived, that made closeness feel like danger instead of safety? You were never the origin of that fear. You simply walked, unknowingly, into a room that was already haunted long before you opened the door. And now we arrive at the point I most want to plant deep inside you tonight, because everything we've talked about, the vulnerability, the missing attunement, the broken mirror, the transactional affection, the old wounds being reenacted in your bedroom, all of it points toward one single truth that I need you to take with you when you leave here. Their inability to be intimate with you was never a measurement of your worth. It was only ever a measurement of their own capacity. I want you to really sit with the word capacity, because it's different from worthiness, and confusing the two is what keeps so many people trapped in cycles of self-blame that were never theirs to carry. Worthiness is about whether you deserve love. Capacity is about whether a specific person with a specific history and a specific set of unhealed wounds has the internal resources available to give that love in the way it needs to be given. These are not the same thing, and yet so many of us spend years treating them as if they're taking someone else's limitation and wearing it as evidence of our own inadequacy. Think about it this way. If someone hands you a cup with a hole in the bottom and asks you to fill it with water, and the water keeps draining out no matter how much you pour in, would you conclude that there's something wrong with the water? Of course not. You would recognize immediately that the cup itself cannot hold what it's being given. And yet, in relationships like the one we've been describing tonight, so many of us do exactly that. We look at a person who structurally cannot hold intimacy because of how they relate to vulnerability, because of what closeness triggers in their nervous system, because of the survival strategies built decades before we arrived, and we conclude that we are the problem. We start believing we are not attractive enough, not interesting enough, not easy enough, not enough, period. When the truth was never about the water, it was always about the cup. This distinction matters enormously because the story you tell yourself about why something happened determines what you do next. If you believe the withdrawal was about your worth, you will spend your energy trying to become more beautiful, more accommodating, more perfect in the hopes that eventually you'll be enough to break through. and you will exhaust yourself chasing something that was never actually about you to begin with. But if you understand that it was about their capacity, something shifts. You stop performing surgery on yourself to fix a wound you didn't create. You stop auditioning for love that was never going to be freely given, no matter how well you performed. And you start asking a much more useful question, not how do I become enough for someone who cannot receive me, but where can I take this same love, this same devotion, this same willingness to be close and give it to someone who actually has the capacity to receive it? Because that person exists. Capacity for real intimacy is not rare because it's impossible. It's rare because it requires the kind of internal work most people never do. But some people do that work. Some people have already faced their fear of closeness and moved through it. And when you meet someone like that, you will finally understand, retroactively, that nothing was ever wrong with you. You were simply pouring yourself into a cup that could not hold what you had to give. So if you take one thing from tonight, let it be this. You were never unlovable. You were simply standing in front of someone who did not have the capacity to love you the way you needed to be loved. Your task now is not to shrink yourself smaller in the hope that they will finally see you. Your task is to walk toward a life and toward people where your love is never treated as something to be earned, rationed, or survived. Because the love you deserve was never supposed to feel like a negotiation. It was supposed to feel like coming home. So let this be the moment you stop looking for the flaw in yourself and start recognizing the truth of what happened to you. You were not too much, and you were not too little. You simply gave your closeness to someone who did not have the capacity to hold it, and no amount of shrinking, performing, or waiting would have ever changed that. Your task now is not to earn what should have been freely given. It is to walk forward, gently and without shame, toward a love that does not require you to disappear in order to be kept. Because real intimacy was never meant to feel like a negotiation, a performance, or a wound reopened night after night. It was meant to feel like safety. It was meant to feel like being met. It was meant to feel simply and